Ah, welcome, and thanks for joining me today. We are reading Chapter 2 in Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology, and we're going to read the first part of Section 3 in Chapter 2 called The Imprints of Early Infancy. Certain imprints impressed upon the nervous system in the plastic period between birth and maturity are the source of many of the most widely known images of myth. Necessarily the same for all mankind, they have been variously organized in the differing traditions, but everywhere function as potent energy releasers and directors. The first indelible imprints are those of the moment of birth itself. The congestion of blood and sense of suffocation experienced by the infant before its lungs commence to operate give rise to a brief seizure of terror, the physical effects of which, caught breath, circulatory congestion, dizziness, or even blackout, tend to recur more or less strongly whenever there is an abrupt moment of fright, so that the birth trauma, as an archetype of transformation, floods with considerable emotional effect the brief moment of loss of security and threat of death that accompanies any crisis of radical change. In the imagery of mythology and religion, this birth, or more often rebirth, theme is extremely prominent. In fact, every threshold passage, not only this from darkness of the womb to the light of the sun, but also from childhood to adult life and from the light of the world to whatever mystery of darkness may lie beyond the portal of death, is comparable to a birth and has been ritually represented practically everywhere, through an imagery of re-entry into the womb. This is one of those mythological universals that surely merit interpretation, rather from a psychological than from an ethnological point of view. The water image in mythology is intimately associated with this motif, and the goddesses, mermaids, witches, and sirens that often appear as guardians or manifestations of water, wells, watercourses, youth-renewing cauldrons, ladies of the lake, and other water nixies, may represent either its life-threatening or its life-furthering aspect. The late classical story of Actaeon, for example, as rendered in Ovid's Metamorphoses, tells of a hunter, a vigorous youth in the prime of his young manhood, who, when stalking deer with his dogs, chanced upon a stream that he followed to its source, where he broke upon the goddess Diana bathing, surrounded by a galaxy of naked nymphs. And the youth, not spiritually prepared for such a supernormal image, had only the normal look in his eye. Whereupon the goddess, perceiving this, sent forth her power and transformed him into a stag, which his own dogs then immediately scented, pursued, and tore to bits. On the simple level of a typical Freudian reading, this mythical episode represents the prurient anxiety of a small boy discovering mother. But according to a more sophisticated, sublimated vein of reference, more appropriate to the post-Alexandrian atmosphere of Ovid's elegant art, Diana was a manifestation of that goddess mother of the world whom we have already met as Queen Isis, and who, as she herself has told us, was known to the cultures of the Mediterranean under many names. The case surely is that of an upadi, an inferior object, mother image, serving as symbol of a superior, the mystery of life. Meditating, we may emphasize the superior, in which case we are performing what in India is termed sampad upasana, accomplished or perfected meditation. Or we may emphasize the inferior, which is termed adhyasa upasana, superimposed or false meditation. The first elevates to the supernormal. The second leaves one about as Actian, to be psychoanalyzed finally to bits and return to the womb. At her greatest temple city in Asia Minor, at Ephesus, where in AD 431 the Virgin Mary would be declared to have been truly the God-bearer, the great goddess, the mother of all things, was represented as Artemis, Diana, with a multitude of breasts. Innumerable figurines, furthermore, of naked goddesses, or rather in the spirit of her own perfected teaching, we should say, of the naked goddess, have been found throughout the excavated ruins of the ancient world. As Heinrich Zimmer observed in his commentary on a Hindu version of her story, if one inquires to know her ultimate origin, the oldest textual remains and images can carry us back only so far and permit us to say, thus she appeared in those early times, and so she may have been named, and in such a manner she seems to have been revered. But with that we have come to the end of what can be said. With that we have come to the primitive problem of her comprehension and being. She is the prima mobile, the first beginning, the material matrix out of which all comes forth. To question beyond her into her antecedents and origin is not to understand her, is indeed to misunderstand and underestimate, in fact to insult her. And anyone attempting such a thing well might suffer the calamity that befell that smart young adept who undertook to unveil the veiled image of the goddess in the ancient Egyptian temple of Sais, and whose tongue was paralyzed forever by the shock of what he saw. According to the Greek tradition, the goddess has declared of herself, "No one has lifted my veil." It is a question not exactly of the veil, but of the garment that covers her female nakedness. The veil is a later misinterpretation for the sake of decency. The meaning is, I am the mother without a spouse, the original mother. All are my children, and therefore none has ever dared to approach me. The impudent one, who should attempt it, shames the mother, and that is the reason for the curse. In the tale of Actaeon, we have this same religious theme rendered in a comparable image. And though Diana would fain have had her arrow ready, Ovid tells us, what she had, she took up, the water, and flung it into the young man's face. And as she poured the avenging drops upon his hair, she spoke these words, foreboding his coming doom. Now you are free to tell that you have seen me unrobed, if you can tell. The water is the vehicle of the power of the goddess, but equally it is she who personifies the mystery of the waters of birth and dissolution, whether of the individual or of the universe. For in the vein of myth, the elemental mode of representation may alternate with that of personification. At the opening of the book of Genesis, is it not written, for example, that the Spirit or wind of God was moving over the face of the waters? Water and wind, matter and spirit, life and its generator, these pairs of opposites are fused in the experience of life, and their world-creating juncture may be represented elementally, as in this opening of the Bible, or on the other hand, as in the art of the tantric Buddhism, in the image of the divine male and female in sexual embrace. The mystery of the origin of the great universe or macrocosm is read in terms of the procreation of the little universe, the microcosm, and the amniotic fluid is then precisely comparable to the water that in many mythologies, as well as in the pre-Socratic philosophy of the Greek sage Thales of Miletus, circa 640 to 546 BC, represents the elementary substance of all things. This manner of homologizing the personal and the universal, which is a basic method of mythological discourse, has made it possible for Freudian psychoanalysts whose training in the language of symbols has been derived from a study primarily of neurotics, to translate the whole cultural inheritance of mankind back into nursery rhymes. But the problem of the neurotic is precisely that instead of accomplishing the passage of the difficult threshold of puberty, dying as an infant to be reborn as adult, he has remained with a significant fraction of his personality structure fixed in the condition of dependency. Rejecting emotionally the reorganization of his childhood imprints through the myths and rites of a maturely functioning community, he can read the picture language of his civilization only in terms of the infantile sources of its developed and manipulated figures. Whereas in the mythology and rites, these have been applied to a cultural and simultaneously metaphysical context of illusions. Freud theoretically devaluated such culturally and philosophically inspired repatternings, terming them mere secondary elaborations, which is perhaps appropriate when the case in question is the nightmare of some 40-year-old sub-adolescent weeping on a couch. But in the reading of a myth, such a reductive method commits us to the monotony of identifying in every symbolic system only the infantile sources of its elements, neglecting as merely secondary the historical problem of their reorganization. Pretty much as though an architect viewing the structures of Rome, Istanbul, Mohenjo-Daro, and New York were to content himself with the observation that all are of brick. In the present chapter, we are examining bricks. Hereafter, we may take bricks for granted and concern ourselves with their employment. For as a Jungian friend of mine once epitomized the problem, it is the predicament of the neurotic that he translates everything into the terms of infantile sexuality. But if the doctor does so too, then where do we get? The state of the child in the womb is one of bliss, actionless bliss, and this state may be compared to the beatitude visualized for paradise. In the womb, the child is unaware of the alternation of night and day or of any of the images of temporality. It should not be surprising, therefore, if the metaphors used to represent eternity suggest to those trained in the symbolism of the infantile unconscious, retreat to the womb. The fear of the dark, which is so strong in children, has been said to be a function of their fear of returning to the womb. The fear that their recently achieved daylight consciousness and not yet secure individuality should be reabsorbed. In archaic art, the labyrinth, home of the child-consuming minotaur, was represented in the figure of a spiral. The spiral also appears spontaneously in certain stages of meditation, as well as to people going to sleep under ether. It is a prominent device, furthermore, at the silent entrances and within the dark passages of the ancient Irish kingly burial mound of Newgrange. These facts suggest that a constellation of images denoting the plunge and dissolution of consciousness in the darkness of non-being must have been employed intentionally from an early date to represent the analogy of threshold rites of the entry of the child into the womb for birth. And this suggestion is reinforced by the further fact that the Paleolithic caves of southern France and northern Spain, which are now dated by most authorities circa 30,000 to 10,000 BC, were certainly sanctuaries not only of hunting magic, but also of the male puberty rites. A terrific sense of claustrophobia and simultaneously of release from every context of the world above assails the mind, impounded in those more than absolutely dark abysses, where darkness is no longer an absence of light, but an experienced force. And when a light is flashed to reveal the beautifully painted bulls and mammoths, flocks of reindeer, trotting ponies, woolly rhinos, and dancing shamans of those caves, the images smite the mind as indelible imprints. It is obvious that the idea of death and rebirth through ritual, and with a fresh organization of profoundly impressed sign stimuli, is an extremely ancient one in the history of culture, and that everything was done, even in the period of the Paleolithic caves, to inspire in the youngsters being symbolically killed a reactivation of their childhood fear of the dark. The psychological value of such a shock treatment for the shattering of a no longer wanted personality structure appears to have been methodically utilized in a time-tested pedagogical crisis of brainwashing and simultaneous reconditioning of the IRMs for the conversion of babes into men, dependable hunters, and courageous defenders of the tribe. The concept of the earth as both bearing and nourishing mother has been extremely prominent in the mythologies both of hunting societies and of planters. According to the imagery of the hunters, it is from her womb that the game animals derive, and one discovers their timeless archetypes in the underworld, or dancing ground, of the rites of initiation. Those archetypes, of which the flocks on earth are but temporal manifestations sent for the nourishment of man. Comparably, according to the planters, it is in the mother's body that the grain is sown. The plowing of the earth is a begetting, and the growth of the grain a birth. Furthermore, the idea of the earth as mother, and of burial as a re-entry into the womb for rebirth, appears to have recommended itself to at least some of the communities of mankind at an extremely early date. The earliest unmistakable evidences of ritual and therewith of mythological thought yet found have been the grave burials of Homo neanderthalensis, Homo neanderthalensis. There we go. A remote predecessor of our own species, whose period is perhaps to be dated as early as 200,000 to 75,000 BC. Neanderthal skeletons have been found interred with supplies, suggesting the idea of another life, accompanied by animal sacrifice, wild ox, bison, and wild goat, with attention to an east-west axis, the path of the sun, which is reborn from the same earth in which the dead are placed, in flexed position, as though within the womb, or in a sleeping posture, in one case with a pillow of chips of flint. Sleep and death, awakening and resurrection, the grave as a return to the mother for rebirth. But whether Homo neanderthalensis thought the next awakening would be here again or in some other world to come, or even both together, we do not know. So much, then, for the imagery of birth. So we'll stop there for today. Next time, we'll take up the next part of this third part of Chapter 2. Thank you for joining me and enjoy your day. See you soon.